There is a kind of silence that does not comfort. It does not arrive with the settling of dust or the drawing of curtains at the end of a long day. It arrives suddenly, like a door slammed shut in a house you thought was empty. And when it does, it leaves behind something no one can quite name. That is the silence that fell over Harrow Hall on the night of October 14th, 1837. 43 people vanished before morning. Not one body was ever recovered. Not one trace of struggle was found. Not one explanation was ever officially entered into the record. And the men who were paid to find answers stopped asking questions faster than anyone could account for. What remained was a plantation house still warm with lit candles, a supper table set for 9, and a silence so total, so deliberate, that the man who first walked through those grounds the following morning later told a neighbor he had never in his life felt afraid of a place the way he felt afraid of Harrow Hall. He could not say why. That was the part that bothered him most. And it should bother you too. Before we continue with the story of Harrow Hall, if you've never heard what happened on that October night in the Carolina backcountry, you are about to understand why this story was buried for nearly 40 years and why the people who tried to unearth it were quietly, methodically discouraged from doing so. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one, and drop a comment below telling us where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's go back to 1837. To understand what happened at Harrow Hall, you first have to understand what Harrow Hall was. Not just as a property, not just as a name on a deed, but as a living, breathing world unto itself, governed by its own laws, its own rhythms, its own unspoken rules that everyone who lived there understood without being told. The plantation sat in the Carolina backcountry, roughly 18 miles east of a trading settlement called Berwick's Crossing, a place that no longer exists on any modern map, but that appeared on surveying charts from the 1820s as a loose cluster of buildings along a creek that fed eventually into the PD River. The land itself was flat and heavy, the kind of terrain that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, where the tree line pressed close on all sides and the sky above the fields was always somehow smaller than you expected. In autumn, the cotton that had dominated those acres through the long, punishing summer had already been picked and ginned and baled, and what remained were the skeletal stalks, row upon row of them, brown and brittle, catching in the October wind and making a sound that one visitor once described as something between a whisper and a rattling bone. Harrow Hall itself, the main house, was a 2-story timber frame structure built in the early 1810s by a man named Cornelius Tanner, who had come south from Virginia with money enough to purchase 500 acres and the ambition to turn them into something permanent. The house was not grand by the standards of the great coastal plantations, no towering white columns, no sweeping oak alley leading to the front door, but it was solid and deliberate in the way that men of Cornelius Tanner's temperament tended to build things. Every beam was squared, every board fitted tight. The kitchen was a separate structure, as was the smokehouse and the cotton gin house. There was a well near the yard, a barn large enough for a dozen animals, and behind the main house, set back from it by perhaps 200 yards, the rows of slave cabins that housed the men, women, and children who made every inch of Harrow Hall possible. By 1837, Cornelius Tanner had been dead for 6 years. The plantation passed to his only surviving son, Elias Tanner, who was 34 years old at the time of our story, recently married to a woman named Eleanor Vance, the daughter of a merchant family from Columbia, and deeply, almost frantically concerned with maintaining the appearance of prosperity that his father had worked so hard to establish. Elias Tanner was not a cruel man in the way that cruelty announces itself. He was not given to rages, not known as a man who took pleasure in the exercise of power for its own sake. He was, in the words of a neighboring landowner who later gave testimony regarding the events of October 1837, a man who did what the situation required of him and called it order. That distinction between deliberate malice and the quiet, institutional violence of simply maintaining a system is one that historians have wrestled with ever since. But the people who lived in those cabins behind the main house did not have the luxury of such distinctions. For them, the shape of Elias Tanner's character mattered far less than the shape of the world he controlled. Eleanor Tanner was a more complex figure than her husband. She had come to Harrow Hall as a bride at 22, bringing with her a piano, 3 crates of household goods, and a sensibility shaped by a genteel upbringing that had kept her, for most of her life, at a comfortable distance from the realities of where her family's prosperity ultimately came from. She was not ignorant. She was, by the standards of her time and place, well read, and there were letters among her papers discovered decades later that suggested a private moral reckoning that she never allowed to surface in any visible way. What she chose to do with that reckoning, or what she chose not to do, became in time one of the more troubling questions surrounding the events of that October night. The third member of the Tanner household, at least among those who lived inside the main house, was Garrett, Elias's younger brother, who occupied the 2 rooms at the back of the 2nd floor and who had arrived at Harrow Hall in the spring of 1836 under circumstances that were never entirely explained to anyone's satisfaction. Garrett Tanner was 28 in 1837. He had spent several years in Charleston, doing what, precisely, no one was willing to say plainly, though the word debts appeared in more than one account of his history. And he had come to Harrow Hall, it seemed, not out of brotherly affection, but out of necessity. He and Elias maintained a relationship of civil distance. They ate at the same table. They did not, as far as anyone could determine, trust each other. And then there was Ward Driscoll. If any single figure in this story requires careful introduction, it is Ward Driscoll. He arrived at Harrow Hall in March of 1837, 7 months before the October night that would make the plantation a subject of whispered speculation across 2 counties. Hired as overseer following the abrupt departure of his predecessor, a man named Clifton Haywood, whose own leaving had been sudden enough to generate its own quiet rumors. Haywood had overseen Harrow Hall's enslaved workforce for 3 years, and his departure, which he made at night, with his belongings packed and his horse saddled before anyone in the main house was awake, was not, in itself, an event that Elias Tanner had any particular interest in explaining. Overseers came and went. The work continued. But Haywood's departure was not simply a professional resignation. The men and women in the cabins behind the main house knew things about why Clifton Haywood had left in the dark that Elias Tanner did not, and the arrival of Ward Driscoll, the man who replaced him, changed the atmosphere of Harrow Hall in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Driscoll was a tall man, lean in the way of someone who had spent years in physical labor, with a pale and weathered face that seemed to have settled into a permanent expression of assessment, as if he were always measuring the distance between where he stood and where he needed to be. He came with a single letter of recommendation from a plantation near the North Carolina border, signed by a landowner named Gideon Falk, who described Driscoll as a man of decisive character and firm principles, well suited to the management of a large property. What Falk did not mention, what was only discovered later, through the kind of patient archival work that takes decades and requires someone stubborn enough to keep looking, was that Driscoll had left Falk's employment under circumstances that bore a striking resemblance to the way Clifton Haywood had left Harrow Hall. At night, without notice, with a silence behind him that no one wanted to disturb. By the summer of 1837, the world of Harrow Hall had settled into a new rhythm under Driscoll's oversight, a rhythm that everyone inside those gates could feel, but that no official document, no letter, no record of any kind would ever fully capture. And underneath that rhythm, in the spaces between the visible and the documented, something was being planned. Something patient, something careful, something that had been years, perhaps longer, in the making. History has a tendency to record the names of the people in the main house. It is less reliable about the names of the people who built it, maintained it, fed it, and made everything inside it possible. But those names existed. They appear in fragments, in estate inventories, in church records, in the accounts of abolitionists who traveled through the South collecting testimony in the years that followed, and piecing them together is one of the only honest ways to tell this story. Reuben was 41 years old in the autumn of 1837. He had been at Harrow Hall since the age of 7, brought there by Cornelius Tanner from a property in Virginia, and he had spent those 34 years accumulating the kind of knowledge that comes only from long, close observation of a place and its people. He knew the land. He knew which section of the low field flooded in a wet spring. He knew which boards in the cotton gin creaked in a particular way that meant they needed replacing. He knew the names of every animal in the barn and could tell from the sound of a mule's step whether it was favoring a leg. He was, in the estimation of virtually everyone who had any dealings with Harrow Hall during those years, indispensable, and he had spent a significant portion of his life understanding exactly what that meant and exactly what it did not. Reuben was tall, spare, and deliberate in his movements, with a face that had learned through long practice to express only what he chose to express. He spoke little around the people in the main house, around his own people, in the cabins, in the quiet moments after the work was done and before it began again. He was different. He was the kind of man that others turned toward without being quite sure why, the way a compass needle turns. Not because he was loud, not because he demanded attention, but because he was steady in a way that made other people feel steadier. His wife, Delia, was 36. She worked in the main house, in the kitchen primarily, but also in whatever capacity Eleanor Tanner required her presence, which meant that Delia moved through the main house with a freedom of physical access that was unusual, and that, as we will see, mattered enormously in the weeks leading up to October 14th. Delia was sharp in the way of someone who had been forced by circumstance to understand people quickly and completely, because understanding people was, for her, a matter of survival. She read rooms the way a sailor reads weather, with attention to small signals that others might dismiss. A change in the angle of a shoulder, the way a sentence ended a half-beat too quickly, the direction a man's eyes moved when he was told something he didn't believe. She had been reading Ward Driscoll since the week he arrived, and what she read had frightened her in a way that the previous overseer, for all his faults, had not. It was not what Driscoll did that frightened her. It was the quality of attention he paid to things that other men in his position never bothered to notice. He watched. He remembered. He catalogued. He had, within his first 2 months at Harrow Hall, learned more about the internal life of the cabins, the relationships, the small economies of trust and favor that existed among the enslaved community, than Clifton Hayward had learned in 3 years, and he had done it without appearing to try. That was the thing that made Delia's stomach turn cold when she thought about it at night. Driscoll was not careless. He was the opposite of careless. And a man like that, in the position he occupied, with the authority he held, was a different and more dangerous thing than a man who was simply brutal. The third figure at the center of this story was August. He was 19 years old, the youngest of the 3 in terms of the role he played in what happened, but not in terms of understanding. August had been born at Harrow Hall, the son of a man named Henry, who had died when August was 12, and a woman named Nora, who had been sold away to a property in Georgia when August was 15. He had, in the 2 years since his mother's sale, become something quieter and harder than he had been before, in the way that a stone becomes harder when the water that surrounded it is removed and the air gets to it. He was not bitter in any way that showed outwardly. He worked with a focus that Driscoll had noted approvingly in the first weeks of his arrival, which meant that August had achieved the rare and difficult thing of being noticed as capable without being noticed as dangerous. But August had something that neither Reuben's steadiness nor Delia's perceptiveness could provide. He could read. Not well, not fluently, but enough. He had learned in the way that enslaved people who learned anything in the antebellum South had learned, covertly, in fragments, at enormous personal risk, from sources that were never the same twice. A page from a discarded almanac, the label on a crate, the back of a broadside nailed to a post at Berwick's Crossing. Over years of this, he had assembled something functional, not literacy in any formal sense, but the ability to decode enough of a written document to understand its essential content. And in the summer of 1837, a document had come to Harrow Hall that August very much needed to understand. The letter arrived at Harrow Hall in July of 1837, addressed to Elias Tanner, carried from Berwick's Crossing by a boy who made the postal run 3 times a week on a sway-backed mare. It was a routine delivery among several others: a bill of lading, a copy of a Columbia newspaper, a note from Eleanor's mother, and it was opened at the dining room table by Elias Tanner on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of July, while Delia cleared the breakfast things around him. She did not read over his shoulder. She did not need to. She watched his face. Elias Tanner was not a man given to visible emotion, but as he read that letter, a single page, folded once, sealed with plain wax, something happened behind his eyes that Delia had never seen before. It was not anger. It was something closer to calculation. The rapid internal movement of a man reassessing a situation he had thought was under control and discovering that it was not. He folded the letter, placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, and left the dining room without finishing his coffee. Delia finished clearing the table. She went to the kitchen. She set down the plates she was carrying with a care that was excessive for the situation. The careful movements of a person managing something inside themselves that they cannot afford to let out. Then she went to find Reuben. She did not tell him what she had seen, not yet. She was not certain enough, but she filed it in the precise, orderly archive that she maintained behind the composed surface of her daily life, and she waited. 3 days later, she found the letter. It had not been hidden in any sophisticated way. Elias had placed it in the top drawer of the writing desk in his study, a room that Delia entered twice a week to dust, and that Elias, in his confidence that the letter was simply another administrative document in a drawer full of them, had not thought to secure. She did not take it. She would not have been able to explain a missing letter, and she was too careful for that kind of exposure. Instead, she memorized what she could of its first paragraph, which was enough, and closed the drawer and left the room and waited for the right moment to find August. The letter was from a land agent in Columbia named Percival Oates. Its content, as best as August was later able to reconstruct from what Delia had memorized of the key passage, was this: Elias Tanner had, at some point in the preceding years, taken on a substantial debt secured against Harrow Hall's enslaved population. The debt was overdue. The agent was writing to inform Tanner that if the balance was not satisfied before the end of the calendar year, the creditor, a man whose name appeared in the letter but that Delia had not been able to commit to memory, would move to enforce the security, which meant in plain language a forced sale, not of the land, not of the house or the cotton gin or the barn or the livestock, of the people, all of them, or enough of them to satisfy what was owed, which by the agent's estimation might mean as many as 30 individuals. In a community of 43, 30 was not a partial dissolution. It was an end. August sat with this information for a long time before he brought it to Reuben. He sat with it the way you sit with something that has changed the shape of your world and that you cannot unknow. Then, on a Sunday evening in late July, when the light came low and orange across the stubble fields, and the air smelled of the particular mixture of dust and cooling earth that August had known all his life, he went to find the older man. Reuben listened without interrupting. He sat on the step of his cabin, his hands clasped between his knees, his face doing that thing it did, that absolute deliberate stillness, and he listened until August had said everything there was to say. Then he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a voice too low to carry, "How long do we have?" August told him, "Until the end of December at the latest." Reuben nodded. He looked out across the fields, at the failing light, at the familiar landscape of a place where he had spent 34 years of his life. He looked at it with the specific quality of attention of a man who is considering the possibility that he is seeing something for the last time and deciding very quietly what to do about it. "Then we have until October," he said. "Maybe November. Not longer." August did not ask him why those months specifically. He understood. October was when the cotton was in, when the year's work was finished, when the ground was dry and the nights were long enough to matter. He understood because he had spent his entire life paying attention to exactly these things. What he did not yet understand was that Reuben had been thinking about this possibility. Not this specific letter, not this specific creditor, but the fundamental instability of their situation and what it might eventually require, for much longer than July of 1837. Much, much longer. There were things that Reuben carried in him that he had never spoken aloud to another living soul. Things that had to do not with Harrow Hall alone, but with the wider world, the geography of it, the routes through it, the names of people in places he had never been but knew existed. To explain how Reuben had come to know what he knew, you have to go back several years. You have to go back to a summer evening in 1833, when a man named Tobias, a free black carpenter from a town called Lancaster, some 50 miles to the north, came to do repair work on the roof of the Harrow Hall barn and stayed for 3 days. Tobias was not just a carpenter. That is to say, carpentry was what he did for money, and he was good at it. But it was not the only work he performed on those 3 days at Harrow Hall. On the evening of his second day, while Elias Tanner was away at Berwick's Crossing conducting business, Tobias and Reuben sat together in the barn until very late. And what passed between them was something that Reuben had held inside him ever since, with the care of a man who understands that certain kinds of knowledge are both precious and perilous. Tobias told Reuben about routes. Specific routes, with specific landmarks, a creek crossing here, a particular ridgeline there, the location of a safe house attached to a Quaker family 17 miles north, and a second contact point beyond that. He told Reuben about timing, why autumn was better than spring, why new moon nights were preferable to full ones, why a Sunday departure, when the distance between the moment of disappearance and the moment of formal discovery was longest, was worth planning for. He told Reuben all of this in the specific, practical language of a man who had helped others travel this route before and who expected to help others again. Reuben had listened to every word. He had asked questions, careful, specific questions, the kind that told Tobias that the man across from him was not overwhelmed, was not dreaming, but was processing information with the disciplined attention of someone who understood that this knowledge might one day be the difference between everything and nothing. When Tobias left the following morning, roof repaired, payment received, not another word exchanged about what had been discussed. Reuben spent 3 days doing nothing except working and thinking. Then he began to plan. Slowly, carefully, over the following years, without ever allowing what he was planning to become visible in anything he said or did. He talked to people. Not all at once. Not in any way that could be described as a meeting. One at a time. In the most natural of settings, in the field, in the barn, on Sunday evenings. He had conversations that would have sounded, to any observer, like nothing more than ordinary exchanges between people who had lived alongside each other for years. But they were not ordinary exchanges. They were an assessment. He was learning who, among the 42 other people at Harrow Hall, would be willing to go. Who was strong enough, not physically alone, but in that harder, deeper sense? Who had ties elsewhere that would hold them back? Who had children young enough to carry and old enough to walk? He was calculating weight, distance, risk, and will. By July of 1837, when August brought him Delia's news about the letter from Percival Oates, Reuben had been at this work for 4 years. He had not told even Delia the full extent of it, not because he didn't trust her, but because in a world where discovery could come from any direction at any time, knowing less was sometimes the safest form of protection. But now the timetable had changed. What had been a long, careful preparation with an unspecified future destination had become something with a deadline, and the first thing that changed about the plan once Reuben allowed himself to acknowledge the urgency, was that he had to start telling people things he had not told them yet. That process of expanding the circle, of bringing more people into the knowledge of what was being planned, began in August of 1837 and continued with extraordinary care through September and into the first week of October. It was, by any measure, one of the most disciplined acts of collective planning that the Carolina backcountry had ever produced. And because it was done by people who had been rendered legally invisible by the society around them, almost no record of it was ever made. Almost no record, but not quite none. In the second week of September 1837, Elias Tanner gave permission for the Harrow Hall enslaved community to attend a Methodist camp meeting at a site called Peavy Grove, approximately 4 miles from the plantation. This was not unusual. Camp meetings, those great outdoor religious gatherings that swept through the South periodically, drawing both white and black attendees in numbers that could reach the hundreds, had become a fixture of backcountry life by the 1830s, and many plantation owners, Elias Tanner among them, permitted their enslaved workers to attend them. The reasons were various and not always philanthropic. Some believed the Methodist emphasis on discipline and order served their interests. Others simply knew that the social release of a camp meeting reduced, temporarily, the pressure that otherwise built in a captive community with nowhere to go. What plantation owners who permitted camp meeting attendance rarely anticipated was the extent to which those gatherings served a different purpose for the people who attended them, a purpose that had nothing to do with Methodist theology, and everything to do with the opportunity to be, for a few days, among a large crowd of people from many different properties, with a freedom of movement and conversation that ordinary plantation life never allowed. The Harrow Hall contingent, 28 people in total, the remainder being too young, too old, or too recently acquired to make the journey, arrived at Peavy Grove on a Thursday afternoon and departed on Sunday morning. During those 3 days, in the spaces between the preaching and the singing and the communal meals, conversations took place that Elias Tanner never knew about and that no circuit rider ever documented. Reuben spoke to a man named Cyrus, who had come from a plantation near Society Hill and who had traveled further along the route that Tobias had described than Reuben had ever been. Cyrus confirmed certain details, the creek crossing, the ridgeline, and updated others because routes changed over years. People moved, houses that had been safe became unsafe, new contacts appeared where old ones had gone. Delia spoke to a woman named Harriet, whom she had not seen in 3 years, and whose presence at the camp meeting was, for Delia, both a relief and a confirmation. Harriet had information about the land north of Lancaster that she had gathered over the course of 2 previous journeys that had not succeeded. 2 previous attempts to leave, both of which had been interrupted before they got more than a dozen miles from their starting point. She shared what she had learned from those failures with the specific generosity of someone who understands that her hard knowledge might allow someone else to succeed where she had not. Delia listened with tears in her eyes that she allowed herself to shed, because a religious revival was one of the few places where tears did not require explanation. And August, quiet, watchful August, who had spent the 3 days of the camp meeting moving through the crowd with the unobtrusive attention of someone doing nothing more than looking for familiar faces, made contact with a white man. His name, as far as August was ever willing to confirm, was Edmund. He was associated with the Quaker network that Tobias had described to Reuben 4 years earlier, and his presence at a Methodist camp meeting was not incidental. He was there specifically to make contact with exactly the kind of person that August turned out to be. Someone planning to move, someone who needed to know that there were others along the route who were expecting them. Edmund and August spoke for 11 minutes, standing near the food tables in the open air of the campgrounds, their conversation indistinguishable to any observer from the dozens of other casual exchanges happening around them. By the time those 11 minutes were done, August knew 3 things he had not known before: a specific departure window, a first landmark, and a phrase, 3 words in English, that would identify him and the people with him to the first contact point north of Harrow Hall. When the Harrow Hall contingent returned on Sunday morning, they were outwardly identical to when they had left. They took up their tools and their tasks and their careful, practiced expressions of routine compliance. But something had shifted in the air between them, something that anyone paying very close attention might have detected, in the way that a slight but real change in atmospheric pressure can be felt before the weather turns. Ward Driscoll, it turned out, paid very close attention. He noticed it first in the evenings. Something altered in the quality of the silence from the cabins. Not louder, not more agitated, but different. The way a held breath is different from relaxed breathing, even when neither makes a sound. He could not have articulated it precisely, which was, in fact, the thing that made him most suspicious. He was a man who trusted his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that something had changed after the camp meeting. In the first week of October, Driscoll began conducting what he called, in his own mental accounting, a closer observation. He adjusted his evening rounds. He varied the timing of them. Sometimes before supper, sometimes after dark, sometimes in the early morning hours. Never at the same time twice in the same week, so that no pattern could be anticipated. He watched who spoke to whom, and when, and for how long. He noted who seemed tired in the mornings, suggesting late nights. He paid particular attention to Reuben, whose quality of stillness he had always found slightly unreadable in a way that bothered him, and to August, whom he had earlier assessed as a valuable worker, and now began to reassess through a different lens. He did not report his suspicions to Elias Tanner. Not yet. Partly this was professional. A good overseer did not bring a plantation owner problems without also bringing solutions, and Driscoll did not yet have anything concrete enough to constitute a problem in the owner's terms. Partly it was something else, something harder to name. A kind of private satisfaction in the detection itself, in the feeling of being the only one in the main house who understood the shape of what was happening. He wanted to let it develop a little further before he closed it down. That decision, to wait, to watch, to allow things to continue for a few more days before intervening, was the decision that would define everything that followed. Whether Driscoll ever understood that is unknown. He was not the kind of man to leave records of his private reasoning. What he left, instead, was an absence. His name in the Harrow Hall accounts through October 13th, and then nothing. Not a single verifiable document with his name on it after the night of the 14th. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the night of October 14th, you first have to understand the 7 days that preceded it. The days during which everything that had been quietly, patiently, invisibly built over years was compressed into its final, irreversible form. What do you think was happening in those cabins on those long October nights while Ward Driscoll adjusted his rounds and Elias Tanner reviewed his accounts and Eleanor Tanner played her piano in the parlor with the windows shut against the autumn chill? Drop your theory in the comments below. We want to know what you think was coming. And if this story is giving you the feeling that something terrible and something necessary are about to arrive at exactly the same moment, you're right. Stay with us. The 7 days before October 14th were, by every external account available, unremarkable. The cotton had been ginned. The bales were stacked in the gin house awaiting transport to market. The fields were empty of their summer burden and stretched flat and brown in the autumn light. The weather had turned cool, but not cold, the nights dropping into the 50s with a clear sky and a waning moon that by the 14th would be 3 days past new, meaning the night of October 14th would be very nearly moonless. Anyone who had spent time on a farm in the Carolina backcountry in the 1830s would know what that meant. A moonless October night, with clear skies and no precipitation, was about as close to ideal traveling weather as the season allowed. Enough light from the stars to navigate by in open country. Cool enough to move fast without exhaustion. Far enough past the end of the growing season that the roads were quiet. No wagons running cotton to market at odd hours, no extra traffic to notice strangers moving through the darkness. Reuben had known, from the beginning, that timing was a matter of the calendar as much as anything else. He had known from Tobias and confirmed by Cyrus at the camp meeting that the nights of a new moon were when experienced travelers moved. He had placed his departure window in the 3rd week of October, and the waning moon of October 14th was the beginning of that window. It was, in other words, not an accident. It had been chosen. During those 7 days, the preparation that had been building for months was brought to its final stage, and the ways in which this was done, the methods, the logistics, the extraordinary discipline of 43 people maintaining the appearance of complete normality while carrying out a coordinated departure, constitute one of the most remarkable stories of collective action in the antebellum South, even though it would remain largely unknown for nearly 4 decades. Supplies had been accumulated slowly, over weeks, in quantities so small and so ordinary that no individual act of accumulation would register as unusual. Dried corn, salt pork, a length of rope, extra cloth. Each item obtained through the normal course of daily work, the small overflow of a harvest here, the set-aside from a communal meal there, and cached in locations that Reuben had identified over the months of his planning. A hollow in a specific tree, 200 yards behind the farthest cabin. A loose board under the floor of the old smokehouse that had been out of regular use since the spring. Nothing that could not be explained innocently if discovered, and nothing so large in quantity that it suggested in isolation anything beyond ordinary life. There were also arrangements of a different kind, arrangements involving the people themselves and the question of who would go and who would stay. This is the part of the story that is least documented and most difficult to reconstruct, and it is also the part that requires the most careful treatment, because it involves choices made under conditions of extreme duress, and those choices were not simple or uniform. Not everyone at Harrow Hall was part of Reuben's plan, not because they were excluded from trust, but because Reuben and Delia and August had, over the months of their preparation, developed a specific understanding of who could physically make the journey, and who, for reasons of age or health or the particular weight of their circumstances, could not or should not be asked to. There was a woman named Bess, who was 63 years old and who had a heart that sometimes stopped working properly in the night, leaving her gasping and gripping the frame of her cot until the episode passed. There was a man named Old Silas, who was somewhere past 70, and who had told Reuben directly and without apparent sorrow that his traveling days were behind him. There were 2 infants. There was a child of 4 named Clara, too old to carry all night and too young to keep up on her own. These conversations, Reuben and the people who would remain in the quiet spaces of those 7 days, were, by any measure, the hardest part. They were also, in the structure of this story, the part that most clearly reveals the nature of what was being done. Not an impulsive flight, not a panic response to immediate danger, but a considered, organized act by people who had thought carefully about every element of what they were attempting and had made deliberate choices about it, under conditions where deliberate choice was itself a kind of revolutionary act. The people who would stay knew what was happening. Most of them had known for weeks. Their choice to remain, some made willingly, some made under the particular grief of understanding that a body can be willing, but a 63-year-old heart might not, was not a betrayal and was not treated as one. Reuben had been explicit about this in the conversations he had with each of them individually. The people who remained would know nothing, would be able to say truthfully that nothing unusual had happened, would be able to face the interrogation that was certain to come, and it was certain to come, without the burden of knowledge that would put them at risk. This, too, was a form of planning, a form of care exercised under the most improbable of circumstances. By the evening of October 13th, the 43 people of Harrow Hall had, without a single visible rupture of their daily routines, sorted themselves into 2 groups, those who would go and those who would remain. The supplies were in place. The route was memorized, not written, never written, carried entirely in the minds of the people who would need it. The departure signal had been agreed upon. The contact phrase August had received from Edmund at the camp meeting had been passed to 3 other people, so that if August was separated from the group in the first miles, the knowledge would not be lost. And Ward Driscoll, who had been watching very carefully for almost 3 weeks, had not found anything, which was, itself, a signal. The supper table at Harrow Hall was set for 9 on the evening of October 14th, 1837. This detail, the set table, would become one of the most discussed elements of what Hiram Cook discovered when he arrived the following morning. It implied normalcy. It implied that the people who lived in that house had sat down to a prepared meal, then gotten up and left. Or that the meal had been prepared, and the people who prepared it had never sat down. The distinction mattered, and it was never resolved. What is established is this: Delia prepared the evening meal in the kitchen house as she did every evening. The table in the dining room was laid, plates, cutlery, glasses, a covered dish of food still warm when Cook arrived the next day. And Delia did not serve it. At some point, between the preparation of that meal and the hour when Elias Tanner would have expected to sit down to it, Delia walked out of the kitchen house, crossed the yard, and did not come back. That walk across the yard, a distance of perhaps 40 feet, a journey she had made hundreds of times, was the moment when everything Reuben had planned for 4 years became irreversible. The question of exactly what happened in the main house that evening, what Elias Tanner and Eleanor and Garrett knew, or suspected or did, is one that the subsequent investigation never adequately answered. In part because the people who could have answered it were either not talking or not believable, and in part because the official record of that investigation was, as we will see, subject to pressures that had nothing to do with the pursuit of truth. What we know is that by the time the October darkness had fully settled over the Harrow Hall property, somewhere between 8 and 9 in the evening, by the most reliable of the later accounts, there was no sound coming from the cabins. Not the ordinary sounds of an evening, not voices, not movement, not the sounds of children, nothing. Just the wind off the fields and the dry rattle of the cotton stalks and the silence. And the silence was total. To understand how 43 people leave a plantation in a single night without being detected until morning, you have to abandon the assumption that disappearance requires concealment. It does not necessarily. Sometimes the most effective form of disappearance is not hiding but movement, moving at the right speed in the right direction, at the right time, with enough of a head start that detection when it comes arrives too late to matter. The departure was not a single moment. It was a sequence, orchestrated with the kind of operational precision that you would not expect from people who had never run a military campaign, until you remember that the entire lives of those people had been a kind of continuous campaign, a daily navigation of threat and constraint that required exactly the kind of tactical thinking that an escape of this complexity demanded. The first to leave were the people with children. They went in the period after supper was finished and before the evening rounds, moving through the tree line at the back of the property and heading northeast along the creek that Reuben had walked 100 times in the ordinary course of farm work. They carried what they could carry, and they moved quietly, not because they had been told to, but because the people in that group had understood, for longer than any of them could say, that quiet was the language of survival. The second group departed 30 minutes later. They went in a different direction, due north through the Sims property that adjoined Harrow Hall to the northwest, along a route that Reuben had identified because the Sims property ran unfenced on its northern boundary for a stretch of nearly 2 miles, which meant that crossing it left no gate, no fence line, no obstacle that required time. They would rejoin the first group at the creek crossing that Cyrus had confirmed at the camp meeting. The third group, the last to go, was Reuben himself, August, 2 other men, and a woman named Phoebe who had insisted, despite an ankle that was not entirely well, on being in the last group rather than the first, because she was one of the people who knew the full route. If something had happened, if an alarm had been raised, if the first two groups had encountered difficulty, she would know what to do. Reuben was the last person to leave the Harrow Hall property. He stood for a moment at the edge of the tree line and looked back at the place where he had spent 34 years. He did not look at it sentimentally. He looked at it with the flat, clear attention of a man completing an assessment, making sure of something, confirming something. And then he turned and walked into the trees. The candles in the main house were still burning. The supper table was set. The kitchen fire, banked but not extinguished, cast a low orange glow through the kitchen house window. Everything looked exactly the way it would have looked if the people who lived there had simply stepped out for a moment and were about to return. They were not about to return. Hiram Cook was a farmer who lived 3 miles from Harrow Hall and who had an arrangement with Elias Tanner to deliver a load of split-rail fence posts on the morning of October 15th. He arrived, by his own account, given later to the Berwick's Crossing magistrate, at approximately 7:30 in the morning, with a wagon loaded with posts and a hired man named James riding alongside him on horseback. The first thing Cook noticed was the silence. He was not a man given to fancy. He said this explicitly in the account that was recorded by the magistrate and that survives today in a county archive in partial form. He was a plain man, he said, not given to fancy, and he was not in the habit of feeling things about places. But he told the magistrate that as he drove his wagon up the lane toward Harrow Hall, and the silence pressed in around him, he felt a sensation he could not name. Not fear, exactly. Something adjacent to it. The feeling, he said, of a place that was holding its breath. The main house door was unlocked. He knocked. No response. Called out. Nothing. He opened the door. The supper table was set. The food had been there long enough to be cold. The candles in the parlor had burned down to their stubs and gone out, leaving pools of hardened wax on the candlesticks. Eleanor Tanner's piano was open, the lid up, a piece of sheet music on the stand as if the player had stepped away mid-practice. Upstairs, the beds were in various stages of being made or unmade, not the careful arrangement of people who had left with intention, but the ordinary disorder of an interrupted day. There was no sign of struggle, not in the main house, not in the yard. The barn animals were present and had been fed at some recent point. The water troughs were not empty, the hay was fresh enough. The cotton gin was locked with its normal padlock. The smokehouse was secured, and the cabins were empty. Not abandoned in the way of a hasty departure. Nothing was overturned, nothing was broken, but empty in the way of rooms whose occupants have taken with them everything that mattered and left behind everything that did not. Pots on their hooks, tools in their corners, clothing that was worn out or too large or too small, hanging on nails. The particular accumulation of objects that cannot make a journey and have been left deliberately, not accidentally. Cook walked the length of the cabin row twice before he spoke. Then he turned to James, who had followed him in silence, and said something that James remembered verbatim 40 years later, when an interviewer finally found him in his 80s, living in a town in Ohio. What Cook said was, "They're gone, all of them." And then, after a pause, "God Almighty." And then they went to find the sheriff. The sheriff of the county in which Harrow Hall was located was a man named Porter Baines. He was 51 years old, had served in his position for 11 years, and was, by the accounts of those who worked with him, a competent and unsentimental man who approached his duties with the particular efficiency of someone who has seen enough of human behavior to stop being surprised by most of it. He arrived at Harrow Hall with 2 deputies at approximately 11 in the morning on October 15th. He was there for 4 hours. He interviewed Hiram Cook, the hired man James, and Elias Tanner, who had been located at a neighbor's property where he had apparently gone the previous afternoon. A timing that would become one of several details that investigators noted as unusual, though none of them ever pressed it fully. Eleanor Tanner was in the main house when Baines arrived. She had by that point been alone in the house since the previous evening, or so she said. She gave her account calmly, in the careful language of a woman who had spent years managing her expressions. She told Baines she had heard nothing unusual in the night. She had gone to bed at her normal hour. She had awakened to find the house as he was now seeing it. Baines recorded her account. He wrote in the report he filed with the county court 3 days later that Mrs. Tanner appeared composed and cooperative. He did not record what she did not tell him. What she did not tell him. What would only emerge decades later from a source that none of the original investigators had thought to consult is a subject we will return to. What Baines did, in his 4 hours at Harrow Hall, was establish the basic facts. 43 enslaved individuals were unaccounted for. No violence was evident at the site. The escape, for that was what he called it in his report, without apparent surprise or editorializing, appeared to have taken place during the night of October 14th. He initiated what the relevant statutes required. Notification to neighboring county sheriffs, a description of the missing individuals to be circulated through the standard channels, a request for any information regarding the passage of a large group through the region on the night of the 14th. Those requests produced in the following 2 weeks exactly nothing, not a single report of a sighting. Not a single witness who had seen a large group moving through the backcountry on the night of October 14th or the days following. Not one informant. And there were informants in every county of the Carolina backcountry, men who made part of their income reporting on the movements of runaway individuals or groups who had anything useful to contribute. This was itself extraordinary. A group of 43 people moving through populated territory in the middle of October should have been visible to someone. The absence of any sighting report was not conclusive. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it was, even to a man as unsentimental as Porter Baines, worth noting. He noted it in a single line at the end of his report. No reliable information has been received regarding the current location of the said individuals. And then, as far as the official record was concerned, the inquiry ended. Just when we thought the investigation was leading somewhere. Just when it seemed like someone in authority was going to ask the questions that needed asking, the silence closed in again. Not the silence of a plantation at night. The silence of men with authority choosing not to look too hard. If this story is already making your skin crawl, share it with someone who loves unsolved history and hit that like button so more people can hear what actually happened here. Because the real story, the story of why nobody found anything and what someone was hiding and what Elias Tanner knew, is only just beginning. The official record of the Harrow Hall investigation, such as it was, runs to approximately 12 pages. Baines's initial report, 3 pages of witness statements, a document recording the formal notification of neighboring jurisdictions, and a brief summary filed 6 weeks later, noting that the investigation had produced no actionable results and was being placed in abeyance pending new information. That final document, the one placing the inquiry in abeyance, was filed on November 29, 1837, and signed by Porter Baines and countersigned by the county judge, a man named Harlan Voss. It is the last official document in the Harrow Hall file for that year. It is also, on careful inspection, a deeply unusual document. The first unusual thing about it is the speed. 6 weeks from the disappearance of 43 people to the formal suspension of an investigation was, by the standards of the era, remarkably fast, particularly for an event of this scale. The disappearance of 4 or 5 individuals from a single plantation was not uncommon in the Carolina backcountry, and those investigations routinely continued for months. The disappearance of 43 was unprecedented in living memory, and the formal closure of inquiry after 6 weeks was a departure from normal procedure so significant that at least one legal scholar, examining the file in the 1890s, described it as an administrative anomaly without obvious explanation. The second unusual thing is a gap in the file. Between the initial witness statements and Baines's November summary, there should be, based on the normal structure of such investigations, a series of intermediate documents. Follow-up reports from neighboring counties, records of any individuals detained and interviewed in connection with the case, notes from any additional witness interviews. These documents are not in the file. They are not referenced in the November summary as having been received and found unhelpful. They simply are not there. The file goes from the initial October documents directly to the November closure, with nothing in between. This could, of course, have a number of mundane explanations. Documents are lost, misfiled, damaged, destroyed by accident. Archives in the antebellum South were not maintained with the rigor of a modern records management system. The absence of intermediate documents does not by itself prove anything. But it is the third unusual thing about the file that is hardest to explain away. In the November summary, Baines wrote the following sentence, which does not appear to relate to anything else in the document, and which has no obvious referent in the preceding text. The matter having been reviewed with appropriate parties, and the circumstances being of a kind that do not benefit from extended public inquiry. It is the judgment of this office that the foregoing case be closed. The circumstances being of a kind that do not benefit from extended public inquiry. That sentence is not standard legal language. It is not a formula that appears in any other document in the county records from that period. It is a sentence written by a specific man to say a specific thing, that someone, somewhere, had made a determination about what it was and was not desirable to pursue in the matter of Harrow Hall. Who those appropriate parties were, Porter Baines never identified. He died in 1851, leaving no memoir, no private papers, no correspondence that anyone has found that addresses the Harrow Hall matter. The county judge, Harlan Voss, died in 1858. His papers were inherited by his son, who destroyed most of them following a fire that damaged his home in 1862, a fire that the local newspaper described as accidental, and that no one had any particular reason at the time to question. The trail, in other words, went cold in the way that trails go cold when the people who might have followed them chose not to. There is a detail in the Harrow Hall story that the official record acknowledges and then almost immediately drops, and it is the detail that, once noticed, is the hardest to stop thinking about. When Porter Baines arrived on the morning of October 15th, Elias Tanner was not at Harrow Hall. He was at the neighboring property of a man named Abner Prewitt, a farmer who owned a modest piece of land about a mile and a half to the south. Tanner had gone to Prewitt's property on the afternoon of October 14th, hours before the departure of his entire enslaved workforce, and had stayed overnight, arriving back at Harrow Hall on the morning of the 15th just before noon, roughly an hour after Baines had begun his investigation. The official explanation for this absence, as recorded in Baines's report, was that Tanner had gone to discuss a fence boundary dispute that had been ongoing between the two properties. Prewitt corroborated this in his own statement. Tanner had come in the afternoon, they had discussed the fence question over supper, and Tanner had stayed the night because the hour was late. This was plausible. Fence disputes were a constant feature of backcountry life. Overnight stays between neighboring landowners were not unusual. Baines apparently accepted it without pressing further, but there are several things about this account that, when placed alongside the other elements of the story, create a discomfort that the official record does not address. The first is the timing. Elias Tanner left Harrow Hall on the afternoon of October 14th, the day of the departure, hours before it occurred. He was not present when his workforce walked out. Whether this was coincidence or design, his absence ensured that he was not in a position to respond in real time to whatever signal might have reached him from the property. The second is Abner Prewitt himself. In the years following October 1837, Prewitt continued to operate his farm without any apparent disruption to his circumstances. He was not wealthy, not politically connected, not a figure of any particular prominence in the county. He appeared, in short, to be exactly what the official record described him as, a neighbor. But his name appears in one other context that the official record does not mention. In 1834, Abner Prewitt had briefly employed, as a hired hand for the spring planting season, a man named Tobias, a free black carpenter from Lancaster. The same Tobias who had come to repair the Harrow Hall barn roof in the summer of 1833 and had spent 3 days there in conversation with Reuben. Whether this connection means anything, whether Prewitt's relationship with Tobias had any bearing on the events of October 14th, is something that cannot be established from the surviving record. It might be coincidence. In a world this small, in a county this sparsely populated, connections between individuals were often unremarkable. People knew each other. People hired the same workers across seasons and properties. But in a story that has already produced this many coincidences, another one presses against the edges of comfort. And then there is the matter of Eleanor Tanner. Eleanor Tanner was alone in the main house on the night of October 14, 1837. Her husband was at Abner Prewitt's farm. Her brother-in-law, Garrett, was, by her account and by the account recorded in Baines's report, at Berwick's Crossing, where he had gone 2 days earlier and had not yet returned. This meant that on the night when 43 people walked out of Harrow Hall, the only person in the main house was Eleanor. She had prepared the supper table. She had set out the food. She had, at some point in the evening, closed the piano lid, but not entirely, leaving the sheet music in place, the lid resting at an angle against the stand. She had gone to bed, and she had heard nothing. This is what she told Porter Baines, and this is what the official record contains. She heard nothing. She saw nothing. She had no warning and no prior knowledge. The question of whether this was true occupied the mind of one person for a very long time. A woman named Adeline Spratt, the granddaughter of Eleanor Tanner's personal seamstress, a free woman of color from Columbia named Grace, who had made occasional visits to Harrow Hall in the years before 1837, and who had, according to family history passed down through Adeline's line, maintained a correspondence with Eleanor Tanner for several years after the events of that October night. Adeline Spratt was 73 years old in 1875 when she gave the testimony that is, in many ways, the most important document in the entire Harrow Hall story. She gave it to a journalist named Oliver Hatch, who was working for a paper in Columbia, and who had become interested in the story through a chance encounter with the partial Baines report in the county archive. Hatch had spent 2 years looking for anyone who might have direct knowledge of the events of 1837, and when he found Adeline Spratt, he found something he had not expected. She had letters. The correspondence between Eleanor Tanner and Grace, Adeline Spratt's grandmother, had continued from 1838 until 1851, when Grace died. 11 letters survived, held in a box that Grace had kept and that had passed to her daughter and then to Adeline. They were not, for the most part, letters that addressed the events of October 14th directly. Eleanor Tanner was too careful for that, had been by 1838 sufficiently shaped by the experience of living in a world where letters could be read by unintended eyes that she rarely said plainly what she meant, but she said it in other ways. The most significant letter is dated March 12, 1842. It was written 4.5 years after the night of October 14th, and it concerns, ostensibly, a subject entirely unrelated to Harrow Hall. A piece of blue fabric that Eleanor was trying to source from a mercer in Columbia. But, embedded in the letter, with the particular indirection of a woman writing carefully, is this passage: "I have thought often of what you said when last we met, about the nature of actions that cannot be undone, and whether it is better to carry them in silence, or to speak them to someone who will understand. I have decided, as I believe I was always going to decide, though it took me time to arrive at it, that silence is sometimes its own kind of truth. There are things I know about that November, things I have never spoken of to E or to anyone who might bring them back into the light. I do not repent of what I chose not to do, nor of what I chose to do, which may amount to the same thing in the end. I am well. I trust you are also well. The fabric, when you find it, should be a deep blue, and not the pale color they sold me last year, which was unsuitable. I do not repent of what I chose not to do." She said November, not October, the month in which she had given her testimony to Baines, not the night itself. but the sentence preceding it makes the reference clear enough. What did Eleanor Tanner choose not to do? The most direct interpretation, the one that Oliver Hatch arrived at in 1875, and that historians who have since worked with this letter have generally supported, is this. Eleanor Tanner, alone in the main house on the night of October 14th, knew what was happening, or suspected it strongly enough that the distinction between knowing and suspecting was largely academic. She heard the silence fall over the cabins, a silence she had lived with the sounds of her entire adult life at Harrow Hall, and would have recognized the sudden, complete alteration of. She understood, or intuited, what that silence meant, and she chose not to raise an alarm. She could have. She had access to the property's bell, the large iron bell used to signal emergencies and summon workers, mounted on a post at the edge of the yard. She could have gone to the neighboring property for help. It was dark, it was late, but it was not impossible. She could have done something. She chose not to. Whether this was a principled act, a woman who had spent years in private moral reckoning, finally making a choice that aligned with what she had always known to be right, or whether it was something more complicated, more ambivalent, more frightened, is something we cannot determine from a letter about blue fabric. What we can say is that the silence that fell over Harrow Hall on the night of October 14th was maintained in the main house by a woman who heard it and understood it and let it stand. That was its own kind of courage, in a world where courage took more shapes than the official record was usually willing to acknowledge. There is one more figure whose fate requires accounting, and it is the one whose disappearance the official record found most awkward to explain. Ward Driscoll. When Porter Baines arrived at Harrow Hall on the morning of October 15th and conducted his investigation, Ward Driscoll was not present. His quarters, a room attached to the back of the barn, separate from both the main house and the cabins, were occupied. His belongings were there. His tools of office were in their usual places. His horse was in the barn, but Ward Driscoll was not. Baines noted this in his report and recorded it as a point requiring explanation. He listed Driscoll among the individuals whose whereabouts were unknown, not alongside the enslaved community, but as a separate category, with the neutral administrative language of someone who has found something he doesn't quite know what to do with. The investigation produced no answer. Driscoll was never located. No account of his subsequent whereabouts, a new position on another property, a return to North Carolina, any verifiable life activity after October 14th, 1837, was ever established. He simply vanished from the record, the way a man can vanish from a record when no one with the authority to investigate his disappearance has a strong interest in doing so. The question of what happened to Ward Driscoll is the question that the Harrow Hall story has never been able to fully answer. There are several possibilities, and each of them says something different about what happened on that October night. The first possibility is that Driscoll discovered the departure in progress, that his watchful, varied rounds finally brought him to the right place at the right moment, and that he attempted to intervene and was stopped. The absence of violence at the site makes this harder to sustain as a simple narrative, but it does not rule it out entirely. A man stopped in the dark by people who had everything to lose in a situation where the alternative to silence was catastrophic. The details of such an encounter would not necessarily leave visible evidence in the cabins or the yard. The second possibility is that Driscoll discovered the departure, and for reasons that were entirely his own, chose not to intervene. A man who had himself left 2 previous positions under cover of night, whose own history was marked by sudden, unexplained departures, might have looked at what was happening around him on the night of October 14th and made a private calculation that had nothing to do with loyalty to Elias Tanner. Perhaps he saw an opportunity. Perhaps he recognized in what he was witnessing something that his experience in similar situations told him could not be stopped, and chose to remove himself from the equation rather than be associated with a failure of this scale. Men in his profession were paid to prevent exactly this. A failure of this magnitude, in a world where reputation was everything, might have made his professional life effectively over. The third possibility is the one that no official document ever explored, but that, once raised, cannot be put back down. That Ward Driscoll was not caught off guard at all. That he knew in advance what was being planned. That his weeks of careful observation had not failed to detect the preparation. But that what he had detected, and what he had sat with in the quiet of his barn room, had moved something in him that his letter of recommendation from Gideon Falk and his career in the enforcement of the system he served would not have predicted. That Driscoll, the man hired to watch the people at Harrow Hall, had watched them, and had chosen in the end to look the other way. We cannot know. We have only the absence, a horse in a barn, belongings on a shelf, a man who was there and then was not. And that absence, like so many things about Harrow Hall, refuses to resolve itself into certainty. What happened to the 43 people who walked out of Harrow Hall on the night of October 14th, 1837? The full answer to this question would take years to assemble, and the assembly of it was the life's work of Oliver Hatch, the Columbia journalist who found Adeline Spratt in 1875, and who spent the last 2 decades of his life following threads through archives, personal testimonies, church records, and the fragmented documentary trail that the Underground Railroad and its participants left, intentionally scattered, in the years before and during the Civil War. What Hatch established, by the time of his death in 1892, was this: 27 of the 43 individuals who left Harrow Hall in October 1837 reached free territory. The route they traveled, confirmed by the accounts of contact point keepers along the way, several of whom gave testimony to Hatch or left records that he was able to access, went from the South Carolina backcountry north through North Carolina, then into Virginia's western counties and onward through the mountains, avoiding the coastal routes where surveillance was heaviest. The journey took 11 days, by the best of Hatch's estimates. 11 days on foot, with children, carrying what could be carried, moving at night and resting in the concealed spaces of a network of people who were risking everything to provide them. Of the 27 who arrived in free territory, Hatch was able to establish the subsequent lives of 17. Some settled in Pennsylvania. Several went further north. 2 eventually crossed into Canada. One woman, Hatch identified her only by her first name Phoebe, was by 1875 living in Ohio and was the matriarch of a family of 11, the grandmother of children who had never known the word plantation except as history. She was, Hatch wrote, a woman of such self-possession and directness that an hour in her company entirely altered my sense of what the people of Harrow Hall had accomplished. He never found Reuben. He found evidence that Reuben had reached the first contact point, the Quaker safe house north of Lancaster. But after that, the trail went quiet, in a way that suggested, to Hatch, not death, but intentional obscurity. A man who had spent 4 years planning the most careful escape in the county's history would not, upon arriving in free territory, advertise his whereabouts. Reuben, wherever he ended up, had spent a lifetime learning to be invisible when invisibility served him. August, Hatch believed, had settled somewhere in the vicinity of Philadelphia by 1840. He found a reference in a Quaker community record to a young man of the right age, the right physical description, who had arrived in the city in the winter of 1838 and who had subsequently been helped to find work by a member of the Quaker meeting. The entry in the record identified him only by his first name. It noted that he could read and was eager to learn more. Of the 16 people who did not reach free territory, those who had remained at Harrow Hall, and the 16 among the departing 43 who were separated from the main group or turned back in the first days, the records are harder and the stories are less kind. Those who remained were interrogated, not gently, in the weeks following October 14th. The official record does not preserve the content of those interrogations in any detail. What it preserves is the notation, in the county records that no information of actionable value was obtained, which was true because the people who stayed had been protected from that knowledge with exactly this moment in mind. Delia was among those who reached free territory. This is known because of a single document, a letter written in a hand that scholars who later examined it described as unpracticed but precise, dated January 4th, 1838, addressed to a woman in Colombia whose identity is not established. The letter is short. It says, among other things, that the writer has arrived safely at a place she declines to name, that she is well, that she is grateful for what cannot be named, and that she hopes the person reading the letter knows that what was done with full knowledge and full will. The letter is signed with a single initial. D. Oliver Hatch believed it was Delia. The handwriting, unpracticed, as if the writer had only recently learned, was consistent with someone who had been taught to write in her adult years under conditions of great constraint. The date, 3 months after October 14th, fit the timeline, and the phrasing, what was done with full knowledge and full will, had the specific quality of someone who understood that she was writing for a record, even if the record was only a single page in a single letter that might never be found. Full knowledge and full will. Those 5 words are as close as we get in the documentary record of Harrow Hall to a direct statement of what happened on October 14th, 1837, and why. Elias Tanner spent the 3 months following October 14th in a state that his neighbors, the ones who saw him during that period, described variously as agitated, distracted, and, in the words of one observer who knew him well, a man who has looked into a room he didn't expect to see and cannot decide whether to describe what was in it. He did not sue in the courts. This, given the legal framework of the era, is remarkable. Enslaved people were property under the law of South Carolina, and the law provided specific mechanisms for pursuing their recovery, including legal actions against anyone who had assisted in their escape. That a plantation owner who had just lost 43 people, an asset of enormous monetary value by the brutal arithmetic of the slave economy, did not pursue these legal remedies with any apparent vigor, is a departure from normal behavior that the official record does not explain. The debt to the creditor named in Percival Oates's letter, the debt that had precipitated the urgency of Reuben's plan, was, according to later county records, settled in February of 1838. The settlement was made at a substantial discount to the original amount, suggesting that the creditor, understanding that the security for the debt no longer existed, accepted what he could get rather than nothing. Elias Tanner remained at Harrow Hall for another 4 years, operating the property with hired labor, before selling it in 1841 to a man from Georgia who had no connection to the previous history of the place. The buyer never learned why the fields behind the main house felt different from other fields. He never learned why the cabin row had the particular quality of a space that has been inhabited and then departed rather than simply abandoned. He never asked. He had purchased land and a house, and that was what he had. Elias Tanner moved to Columbia after the sale. He died there in 1853. His death notice in the Columbia newspaper described him as a former planter of Lancaster district, known as a man of industry and sound character. It mentioned no wife. Eleanor had died in 1847, in circumstances that the records describe only as an illness of the lungs, brief and severe, and no children. It mentioned no unusual circumstances of his later years. It mentioned nothing about October 1837. It mentioned nothing about 43 people, nothing at all. When Oliver Hatch found Adeline Spratt in a house on the outskirts of Columbia in the autumn of 1875, she was 73 years old and had been waiting, in a sense, for someone like him to appear for a long time. She had the 11 letters from Eleanor Tanner. She had the oral history of her grandmother Grace, preserved with the care of someone who understands that oral history, when written records fail or are destroyed, is the only archive left. She had her own memories. She had been a child during the years of her grandmother's correspondence with Eleanor, and she had heard things in the way that children who are considered too young to understand nevertheless hear and retain. She had carried all of this for 38 years, through the war and its aftermath, through the Reconstruction and its failures, through every change that had swept through the South in the decades since that October night. And she had never spoken of it publicly because there had never been anyone to speak to who would understand. Hatch spent 3 days with her. He took extensive notes. He was, by his own account, in the introduction to the manuscript he eventually produced, a manuscript that was not published in his lifetime and that survived in a single copy in a private archive in Pennsylvania. Shaken by the experience in a way that his years of journalism had not prepared him for. "I had gone looking for a mystery," he wrote. "I found instead a record of human determination so thorough and so carefully made that I was ashamed to have called it mysterious. The mystery had always been in the absence of the record, not in the events themselves. The events were comprehensible enough. It was the silence that had been imposed on them for 38 years that required explanation. And that explanation, when it came, was the most ordinary and most terrible of things. The silence had been maintained because the truth was inconvenient for the people with the power to decide what was documented and what was not. He spent the next 17 years trying to complete the record. He found more contact point keepers. He found church records in Pennsylvania and Ohio. He found the Quaker meeting document that referenced August. He found, in an archive in Greensboro, North Carolina, a single line in an old account book belonging to a man named Calvin Hester, a man who, the surrounding entries suggest, had some connection to the network of assistance that ran through the Carolina and Virginia backcountry in the 1830s. That read, October 17th, 1837. Party of 27 arrived. All well. Movement continued north. 27 souls, 3 days after leaving Harrow Hall, still together, still moving. The manuscript Hatch produced runs to several hundred pages. It was never published. After his death, it passed through several hands before ending up in a private archive in Philadelphia, where it remained largely unexamined until a historian working on a broader study of antebellum escape networks in the 1920s encountered it and produced a brief account of its contents. That account was published in a small academic journal and generated little attention at the time. The Harrow Hall story did not enter the broader historical record in any substantial way until the mid-20th century, when the growing field of African American history began the systematic work of recovering exactly the kind of story that had been deliberately and methodically suppressed. By then, the people it was about had been gone for 100 years. There is a way in which the conventional telling of escape stories, the way they have most often been told when they have been told at all, emphasizes the danger, the pursuit, the narrow escapes, the dramatic reversals of fortune. These elements are real, and they matter, but they can, if they become the only frame, obscure something else about what happened at Harrow Hall. The extraordinary degree to which what occurred there was not a dramatic breaking free, but a deliberate, organized, collectively willed act of the plainest kind. Reuben did not escape. He planned. He spent 4 years in patient, methodical preparation, carrying knowledge he had received from a carpenter in 1833 and transforming it, slowly, into a structure capable of supporting 43 people through 11 days of travel to a destination none of them had ever seen but all of them believed in. Delia did not flee, she observed. She read the letter in the study drawer, and she understood it, and she waited for the right moment to share what she knew, and she managed her own fear with such discipline that the man whose household she worked in, and the overseer whose rounds she had memorized, and the institutional machinery of an entire system of social control, none of them detected it. August did not run. He listened. He learned to read in the stolen fragments of a year he was 12 years old. And he used that reading, 20 years later, to receive information that 11 minutes of conversation at a camp meeting was not enough to fully convey, and to pass it on to the people who needed it. The silence that fell over Harrow Hall on the night of October 14th was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of purpose. It was the thing that happens when a community that has been told, by every mechanism available to the society around it, that it has no agency, no future, no choices, no will that matters, demonstrates in a single night that it has been planning otherwise. That is the silence that Hiram Cook felt when he drove his wagon up the lane on the morning of October 15th, and the air pressed in around him in a way he couldn't name. He was standing in the aftermath of something that the world he lived in had been designed to make impossible. And the impossibility of it, the sheer, quiet, devastating fact of it, was what made the place feel, to a plain man not given to fancy, like somewhere that was holding its breath. The breath had already been released. The people were already miles away. The man from Georgia who purchased Harrow Hall in 1841 planted the fields and worked them for a decade and sold the property in 1852 to a family who used it for timber. By the time of the Civil War, the cotton gin had been dismantled and the barn had partially collapsed, and the main house was occupied by a family who had no connection to the Tanners and no knowledge of what had happened there 25 years before. The cabin row, the row of structures behind the main house where Reuben and Delia and August and 40 others had lived and planned and prepared, was gradually absorbed back into the vegetation that the Carolina backcountry is always trying to reclaim from human occupation. By the end of the century, the structures were gone. The clearing remained for a time, and then it too was overgrown. And by the time the first serious historical inquiries began in the mid-20th century, there was no physical trace of the cabins that could be definitively identified. The main house stood until 1879, when it was damaged in a storm and the then owner chose not to repair it. It was demolished the following year. The site passed through several more owners in the decades that followed, each less aware than the last of what had happened there, until by the early 20th century, it was simply a piece of land in the Carolina backcountry. Flat, heavy, the kind of terrain that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, where the tree line pressed close and the sky above the cleared patches was always so how smaller than you expected. The well near the yard, which had been the practical center of the property's daily life for decades, lasted longest. It appeared on a property survey in 1903, described simply as an old well dry. It was filled in at some point after that. Oliver Hatch's manuscript, the most complete account of the Harrow Hall story ever assembled, remained in a private archive in Philadelphia until the 1960s, when it was donated to a university library. It is accessible to researchers. It has been cited in a handful of academic works. It has never been the subject of a popular history, a newspaper feature, or a commemorative marker. The people it documents never received formal recognition from any institution. There is no plaque at Berwick's Crossing, which is now, in any case, a place that exists only in old surveying charts, that commemorates the night of October 14th, 1837. There is no marker on the land that was once Harrow Hall. There is no official record that acknowledges what was planned there, what was risked there, what was accomplished there. The silence was very thorough. It did its work for a very long time. But silences, even thorough ones, have a way of developing small cracks. A letter survives in a box. An old man in Ohio remembers what Hiram Cook said when he walked the cabin row. A journalist finds a woman in Colombia who has been waiting 38 years for someone to come and ask the right questions. A single line in an account book in a Greensboro archive. October 17th, 1837. Party of 27 arrived. All well. The silence of Harrow Hall was not the silence of nothing. It was the silence of something that had been hidden. And the thing that had been hidden, when it was finally brought into the light, was not a mystery. It was not inexplicable. It was not a ghost story or a tale of the supernatural or an unsolved crime that baffled investigators for generations. It was, instead, What 43 people decided to do with one October night when the moon was dark and the air was cool, and every year of preparation came finally, precisely, to its moment. It was, when all was said and done, the most human thing imaginable. The hardest part of the story, and perhaps the most important part, is this. The night itself was only the end of something. Not the beginning. The beginning was Reuben, sitting on the step of his cabin on a Sunday evening in late July, listening to August tell him about a letter in a study drawer and saying, in a voice too low to carry, "Then we have until October," and deciding, "Dicuam guepilogo okifico." In the spring of 1876, Oliver Hatch published a short article in the Columbia paper, a condensed version of what he had learned from Adeline Spratt and his years of research, stripped of the names that might have exposed people still living to legal or social risk. He published it under a cautious headline and expected little response. He received, over the following 6 weeks, 23 letters. 11 of them were hostile. Men who told him, in language ranging from the formally disapproving to the explicitly threatening, that he had no business disturbing the settled history of the region, that his account was inaccurate, that he should concern himself with more appropriate subjects. 2 of the hostile letters were unsigned, 12 of them were something else. They were from people who had heard, over the years, fragments of the story. A grandmother's recollection, a line in an old letter, a thing a neighbor once said and then didn't say again. They were from people who had always known, in the specific way that communities know things they have decided collectively not to speak aloud, that something had happened in the backcountry in October of 1837 that the official record did not contain. One letter, unsigned, written in a careful and unpracticed hand, contained only a single sentence. They made